Jesus was out one day in the plains, thirsty, and he saw a well in the distance. At the well was a woman. And so Jesus goes to the woman at the well, and he says, "Give me a drink." And she says, "You can't talk to me. We're not supposed to have conversations. We don't talk. You're Jewish, I'm Samaritan. We don't have conversations." And Jesus has a conversation with her that day. There are a lot of folks in the world during that time who would have thought that was taboo, should never have happened. But Jesus thought that it should. He talked to this woman. She becomes an evangelist. She goes out and tells the whole city about this Jesus who told her everything about her life. He knew it all. He knew about her past. He knew about her mistakes. He knew about the struggles that she had had. And he still had this conversation with her. A lot of folks in the world would have looked at him and looked at her and said, that should have never happened. She has a past, She's got a lot of things in the closet, She's done some stuff, And Jesus said, it's not that I don't care about that. It's that I do care. A little bit later, Jesus would show up at a man's tax office. His name is Matthew. We don't know him as that yet, and we don't know really what he's going to become. But Jesus goes to Matthew, and Jesus calls Matthew, the tax collector, to be his disciple, to come follow him. There are a lot of folks in the world during that time who would have said, that should never happen. If you are who you claim to be, and if you are doing what you claim to do, then there's no reason that you're going to invite a guy like that to come and follow you. He's got a past, And the tax collector has his tax office, and you don't get a tax office in the ancient world unless you're pretty good at collecting taxes from people. And by the way, collecting taxes from people is not the noble job that maybe you think it is. It's skimming some off the top to pad your pockets and to line your finances. It's taking advantage of people. They're seen as a traitor. They're seen many times as an enemy, the enemy of God's people. And Jesus says it's not that I don't care about his past. It's that I do care enough to invite him to come along this journey. A little bit later in his life, Jesus would find not just any tax collector, not one that's got just a tax office. He would find one who's known as a chief tax collector. And if you become a tax collector by doing some shady things, you become a chief tax collector by doing some really shady things, right? You've become the boss of all these shady things. And Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. He can't see Jesus. He climbs in the tree to see Jesus. Jesus says, "Zacchaeus, come down. I'm staying at your house today." And there are a lot of people in the world who would have said, you can't do that. That's not how things work. Your kind and his kind, they don't spend a whole lot of time together. That's not how life works. And Jesus says, it's not that I don't care. I know he's got a past. I know what he was. I know what he's been. I know he's defrauded you. He's lied to you. He's stolen from you. He's cheated you. I know all that. But today, salvation has come to this house. And that day, Jesus would also go to that house. A lot of people in the world would have said, had he known what kind of person Zacchaeus was, he never would have been there. Never would have done that. Shouldn't have done that. At some point in his ministry, Jesus finds his way into a man's house. The man's name was Simon the Pharisee. And probably what happens on that day is Jesus is the visiting rabbi at the synagogue, and he goes and he speaks at the synagogue, and an influential person would invite the preacher home for lunch, and that's probably what's happening in Luke chapter 7 here. But in from the streets wanders a woman. We don't know her name. We know her only descriptor in Luke's gospel is she is a sinful woman of the city, and our minds can run with that as far as we let it. And Simon says what everybody's thinking. He says, if he had known what manner of woman she was, then he would have stopped this. And Jesus looks at Simon, knows his heart, knows where it's coming from, and he says, Simon, I got something to say to you. It's not that I don't care about her past. It's that I care so much about her that I'm going to work through it with her. Jesus developed this moniker about him as he went about his life, talking to the women at the well, talking to the tax collectors at the office, and Zacchaeus up in the tree, and this woman at Simon's house, gathering around the table with all kinds of people that a lot of people said, if he had known better, he wouldn't do this. If he'd known what kind of person that was, he wouldn't be at her table, at his table. Had he known really what was going on here, Jesus would separate himself from that. And so he began to have for himself this label, friend of sinners, right? Because of the people that he gathers on the table with. And if you're thinking about why did they think that Jesus was so bad that they've got to put him on the cross, probably number one on the list would be that he claimed to be the Son of God, and they had a problem with that. Understandably, I think they would have had a problem with that. But at least number two on the list is this, that he went to the woman at the well, and he welcomed the woman in Simon's house. And he went to Matthew, and he went to Zacchaeus, And he gathered all the sinners and the tax collectors around him at the table, and he celebrated with them, and he talked with them. And everybody's looking around saying, had he known better, had he known the past of this person, he wouldn't do that. Jesus seems to be thinking on a different level. And so what is it about that? With each one of these encounters that we've talked about, whether it's the woman at the well out on the plains, or whether it's the woman in Simon's house or the tax collectors, with every encounter that Jesus has, there's a choice. I talk to this person, or do I shun them? Do I welcome them to come follow me, or do I keep them at arm's length? Every time he encounters somebody, there's a choice. And that choice is dependent on what religion he is a part of. For a lot of people in the world, they had a religion during that day that said, if they've been doing that, or they've been doing this, or they've been engaged in this, or if they've been in that place, then you can't have anything to do with them. If they've got that kind of past, then you got to cut them off. Jesus lived by a different kind of what I'll call religion. Religion in our world today sometimes has a negative connotation, little baggage with it. We hear sometimes people talk about being spiritual, not religious, but I think I'll tell you today that we are all religious in some kind of way. Like, we all have some kind of religion. If you think about just what the word is, it comes from a Latin combination of words, religio. Sounds pretty neat, doesn't it? Re is to do again, or something like that. It means again. Whenever we redo something, we do it again. Ligio is the word that we get ligament from. And a ligament, I understand, connects a bone to a bone. And so ligio is about connection. And so just the plain, simple word that we have, religion, is really a word that just means to reconnect. For a lot of people in the time of Jesus, their religion meant that they kept reconnecting people to their past. Don't you know what kind of woman that is? Don't you know what kind of woman she is? Don't you know how many people he has defrauded? Don't you know how many people he has cheated in his life? Their religion was one of connecting people to their past and never letting them separate from that past. Jesus practiced a totally different kind of religion. He practiced a religion that did not keep people connected to their past, but it connected people to what God had created them to be. Connected people to something better in their lives. Some may think of Christianity today as a passive, casual kind of religion, but that does not seem at all to line up with the kind of religion that Jesus lived and professed with his life. It was much more radical than that. It is much more intense than that. These encounters that we've talked about just on the front end this morning are things that are radical and intense in the ancient world. And they put Jesus at odds with a lot of people. It made him a lot of enemies, to be a friend of sinners, to not reconnect them to their past all the time, but to connect them to something better, a hope for a future in their lives. That set Jesus and people at odds against one another so much. Why? Why is that the case? Paul was one of those people. Philippians chapter 3 gives us a little bit of insight, but Paul was one of those people that would have been at odds with Jesus. Paul, in his self-description in the beginning parts of Philippians chapter 3, he says, look, if anybody was living an upright, righteous, just, holy life, Paul says, it was me. He gives a whole list of accomplishments that he has, from the family that he's born into, the clan that he's born into, the strict kind of Pharisaic religion that he has adopted in his life, the schools that he attended, the teachers that he had. And he says, you want to talk about zeal for God, for God's ways, God's will, God's law? I was persecuting the church in verse 6. Right? I was doing away with anything that I thought was a threat to the religion that I love so much. That's Paul. And for a long time, Paul would have seen Jesus as a threat to that religion. If it was all about being upright and pure and holy and not connected to any kind of sin in life, then Paul was going to keep those who had a past at arm's length, and he was only going to welcome those who were protecting the law just like he was. Until one day, still fresh off of his persecuting tours, consenting to the death of Stephen, the first martyr, seeking letters to Damascus to go and bind up more Christians, persecute more Christians, probably end the lives of a lot of Christians, Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, meets the Lord there, and his life is changed forever. Here's his commentary on it. This is Philippians chapter 3, verse 12 again. Not that I've already attained it, Paul says, and I'm already perfect. I'm not. But he said, I'm pressing on to make it my own because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Something changed on that road. Brothers, he says, I do not consider that I've made it my own yet, but here's what I do. One thing I do, I forget what lies behind, and I strain forward to what lies ahead. He says, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let's stop right there. There are two things that I want to pick apart from what Paul says in those 3 verses. Number one is that Paul is set on forgetting what is behind him. There were a lot of people in the ancient world that Jesus dealt with, that Paul's going to deal with, who had a real problem with forgetting what was behind them. They had real problems with allowing other people to forget what was behind them in their lives. For Paul, this means he's leaving everything in the past, everything that he was about. He's going to leave it all behind. His whole story, his life, his family, his upbringing, his education, his scholarship, his persecuting days, he's leaving all of that behind. The righteousness that he had attained by the law, the upright life that he had been striving to live, he's leaving it all behind. He says, I count everything back there as loss. It's all loss. Trash, he says. Not that all of it was bad, by the way. I mean, upright life, good. Striving for righteousness, good, noble goals. Trying to be zealous for the work of the Lord, not a bad thing, never a bad thing. Not all of it was bad. Most of it was great. But something changed in Paul. And on that day, he had to forget something that was behind him, forgetting what's behind, so that the second thing he says in that passage is that he can press on. He can strive for what lies in his future, strive for what's ahead. Paul counts his list, everything that he's got going on in the early part of Philippians 3, everything there is loss, rubbish, he says. And he says, I'm counting it all, I'm forgetting what's behind so that I can be more like Jesus. To know him is how Paul phrases it here. To be like him, to be conformed more and more into his image. The focus of Paul's life is now different. His goals have changed. The things that he's striving for in life, they're now different. He's pressing forward. He's moving towards something greater in life, something much better. In his words, he says, I'm just trying to grasp hold of the reason that Jesus has grasped hold of me, right? He got me. He caught me on the road to Damascus for some kind of reason. And Paul says, I'm just trying to hold on to whatever that reason is. I'm letting go of the past, letting go of all those things that I count now as lost so that I can reach out and take hold of the reason that Christ Jesus has taken hold of me. That's his philosophy. That is what Paul is doing. He's very clear in saying, I've not attained that yet. Right? He's saying, I'm trying to forget what's behind. I'm moving forward, but I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. I've not attained that yet. I've not realized what I'm striving for just yet. He wants to be more like Jesus. But Paul says, I'm not where I want to be just yet. This is the Romans passage in Romans 7 where he says, sometimes I do the things that I hate. I don't want to. I don't want to do those things. I hate those things, but I do them sometimes. You ever felt like that? This is where he says in Romans also, I don't do the things that I want to do. I got good, noble, high aspirations, but I don't do those things sometimes. I don't get it done. What I need to get done. You ever feel like that? Paul is saying, I want to be more forgiving, but sometimes I hold a grudge. I want to be more compassionate, but sometimes I have a hard time caring for people. I want to be more helpful to people, but sometimes I'm so busy and I get caught up in my own stuff in life and I just can't do it. I want to care more for people, but I end up caring more about myself sometimes, and I'm a little selfish sometimes. I want to be more righteous, Paul says, but sometimes I do the unrighteous thing, and I make unrighteous habits. I want to be more just, but sometimes I treat people unfairly, and they don't deserve it, but I do it anyway. This is what Paul is saying here. I want to be more loving, but that requires sacrifice on my part, and sometimes I don't want to sacrifice. I want to be more merciful. I want to get it all together, and Paul says, I don't. I'm not there yet. I'm not perfect. I've not attained this, but I am striving for it. You know, Paul's kind of like us, isn't he? I don't know if you've got this picture of the apostles up on a pedestal, and we got Paul up on a pedestal, and he's so good and so right, and he doesn't do anything wrong. That is not Paul at all. Paul's like us. We have the same strivings, the same desires. We want to be better. We want to be more. We want to be more conformed into the image of Jesus. But right now we look at ourselves and we're just not. We are in some ways. We fall short in a lot of ways. We're not perfect. We've not already attained it, but we're trying. We fall short And we get back up and we try again. We mess up, but we get back up and we try again. We make our mistakes because we've not attained it yet. We're not there yet. And so what do we do? Well, there's an interesting play on words in Philippians chapter 3 that we can miss sometimes. In Philippians 3, 12 to 14, we read the word press twice. Twice, Paul says, I press on to the higher call, to the higher call. I'm pressing on, striving for something that is better. He uses it one other time in Philippians 3. It's when he talks about persecuting the church. In verse 6, he says, as to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church. It's the same exact word that he uses for press. I don't know why it's translated differently, but it is. But let's have a little exercise here where we don't translate it as it is in our Bibles. Let's read it. Let's read it like it is in the original. And the word press or persecute that Paul uses is a word that simply means beat or pound or discipline, something like that. And so in verse 6, he says, as to zeal, I was beating the church. I was beating the Christians. I was pounding the Christians, disciplining the Christians. That's what he says. But now in verse 12, not that I've already attained, I'm already perfect, but now I'm pounding myself. I'm beating myself. Same thing he does. One more time. And so what you see here is that Paul's energy, it's the same word, but his energy is being refocused. He's no longer pounding Christians and pounding other people and beating the church. He's turned his focus on himself. He's forgetting what's behind in his life. He's striving for what's ahead in his life, and he's focused his attention on fixing himself, not fixing everybody else. And so the change that Paul makes in Philippians 3 is he's gone from beating up everybody else to kind of taking it out on himself. He's gone from judging others, from judging everybody else, to examining himself and seeing what he needs to change in his life. He's gone from sizing up everybody else in his life and trying to decide how righteous are they? Are they deserving of my pain and my infliction of punishment on them? He's stopped sizing everybody else up and he's taking hold of himself. That's what Paul's doing. That's the change. He says, I've gone from beating other people to disciplining myself. This is what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 7. Judge not that you be not judged. With what judgment you give, it'll be returned unto you. Let's not focus so much on the speck, Jesus says, in our brother's eye, but let's worry about the log or the plank that is in our own eye. Paul says, I'm done. I'm done talking about everybody else's specks in their eyes. Paul says, I got plenty of planks in my own life that I've got to address, and so I press on. I've not attained it yet. I'm not there yet. I'm not perfect yet, but I am striving ahead for something that is better. Paul had a history of beating people, pounding people, because he believed that they deserved it. That woman at the well, she made her mistakes. She did all those things in her past. A lot of people would have said she deserved everything she was going to get, and Jesus says, I don't think so. There's a better way. The woman that finds her way into Simon's house, a lot of folks, Simon himself would have said, that woman, she needs to be expelled from us. She has no right to be in here with us, and she deserves it. And Jesus says, no, I don't think so. That's not how this works. Most people would have thought that Matthew the tax collector had no business joining in with the ragtag group of the disciples of Jesus. He deserved it. He deserved to be an outcast. Zacchaeus deserved to be an outcast in most of their thinking. And Jesus said, that's not how it works, right? When Paul meets Jesus, he figures out that's not how it works. So how do we do it? How do we stop living by what we've done in the past? How do we stop judging others by what they've done in the past? How do we strive for something better in our lives? How do we help others strive for something better in theirs? Very simply, by letting go of the past and holding on to what's in the future. By forgetting what's behind and straining for what lies ahead. I told you about 4 encounters that Jesus had in his life where he seems to implement this Pauline principle before Paul ever writes it. There's one that makes it really clear we haven't addressed yet. There's a woman. She's caught in the very act of adultery. There's no excuse. There's no justifying her behavior. They got her. I don't know who they are. I don't know how they knew. I don't know where they were, but they got her. And in John chapter 8, they have brought her to Jesus. And they bring this woman, caught in the very act of adultery, to Jesus. And they tell him what the Bible says about her condition, right? Law of Moses says this woman should be stoned. And Jesus has a choice to make. A choice not that much different than the choice he made when he talked to the woman at the well, when he invited the woman into Simon's house, when he went to Matthew, the tax collector's office, and when he called Zacchaeus down from the tree. It's not that much different. Jesus has a choice to make. This woman's going to have a choice to make about her own lives. What would the religion of the day say that Jesus does with this woman in John chapter 8? She's caught in the very act of adultery. Law of Moses says that this woman deserves to be stoned. What do you say, Jesus? Do we hold her to the past? Do we strive for something different? And you know, Jesus stoops down and he writes something on the ground. Steps back up. What do you say? And then Jesus has some of the more famous words that he ever says in his entire life. The one who has no sin, throw the first rock. If you here are sinless, then you have the right to do that. They lived by a religion that was connecting people to the misery of their past. She deserves it. Tying her to the past is what we do. She needs to be imprisoned by the guilt of her sin, by the mistakes of her past. There's no hope for her. This is the religion of the day. Jesus was more intent on connecting her to what her future may be. Let the one who has no sin throw the first rock. Jesus is essentially saying, if you're going to practice a religion that ties this woman to her past, then you need to think about your past as well. Who among you can really throw that first rock? Who among us can throw the first one? If you're going to tie her to the past, Jesus says you need to think about yourself. With what judgment you give, remember, it will be returned to you. So let's not think about their specks in their eye. Let's think about the logs and the planks that may be in ours. And Jesus stoops down again after he utters let the one who has no sin throw the first stone. You want to tie her to her past, then you need to think about your past as well. He writes in the ground again. And he steps back up and he says, woman, where are your accusers? Well, they've gone. From the least, the oldest, to the youngest, they went home. Neither do I condemn you. But he doesn't leave it there. That would just be forgetting what's behind, right? He doesn't leave her in the past. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. This is the picture of what Paul is describing in Philippians chapter 3. This woman on the ground, on the screen behind me, it's not that she's perfect. It's not that she's already attained a sinless, upright, righteous, just existence. She's not there. And truthfully, I don't know that she ever got there. None of us do. We don't know. That's the goal. That's what she's striving for. Neither do I condemn you, Jesus says, so go and sin no more. Forget what's behind, Paul says, so that you can strive for what's in the future. Jesus lived his life of helping people forget what's behind them, not religioing them to the past anymore and keeping them reconnected to their past sins, failures, mistakes, guilt, and shame, but freeing them from that so that they can strive for something better in their lives. And so this morning, is there something that is imprisoning you? Is it in your past? But for some reason, you still feel like you're connected to that all the time. Is it a past hurt that you have a hard time getting over? Is it a terrible experience at some point that you just keep reliving in your mind and you're imprisoned by your own memories? Is it shameful behavior that you're ashamed of every day and you keep dwelling on it, you keep thinking about it? Is it violence? Is it unfaithfulness? Is it, maybe like the religion of Jesus' day, is it a holier-than-thou opinion, mindset that imprisons you when you think about other people? What does your religion teach you to do? Tie to the past, reconnect to past guilt, mistakes, or like Paul, can we let go and hold on to the future? What's imprisoning you today? What's holding you back? What is tying you down and keeping you, preventing you from becoming the kind of person that God created you to be? In Hebrews, the writer tells us that if we're serious about this, then we lay aside all the weights that tangle us up, the sins that beset us and get us off track. We lay it all aside. We get rid of all that so that we can press towards what's in the future. What's holding you back this morning? Very simply, with every encounter that Jesus had, there was a choice. Will I tie them to their past? Will I help them strive for something in the future? And I think from Scripture this morning, from Paul's explanation in Philippians 3 this morning, I can present to you the same choice. What are you going to do? Do you continue to tie yourself down, imprisonments of the past, the shame, the guilt, the mistakes, the sin of the past? Or can you let go and move forward to something much better and much brighter than that? You may be here this morning and you're ready to begin this journey of walking with Christ and living a Christian life. And today, maybe you're ready to be baptized into Christ, to go through this death, burial, resurrection where you die to self and you die to the sin, you die to the guilt and the shame of the past, and you come up striving a new kind of life, to strive for something better. Maybe you're a Christian, been one a long time, but for whatever reason, you're held back and you're holding on, and we're imprisoning ourselves in the past, and we need to let go of the past so that we can move forward to something better. It's what the woman at the well does. It's what Matthew, the tax collector, does. It's what Zacchaeus does. It's the woman at Simon the Pharisee's house. It's the woman caught in the very act of adultery. Neither do I condemn you. Let's go and make a better way. Let's go and sin no more and live a better kind of life.